Hey guys, welcome back to another Mastermind Content Masterclass, and in this video we're going to address guilt. So stay to the end because I will share some important information with you and give you some tools that you can use to help you overcome guilt. But the first place to start is to understand why these feelings of guilt are surfacing, and especially if you don't know why you're feeling guilty. So there are two types of guilt. There is intrinsic guilt and there is irrational guilt. Intrinsic guilt is natural. You're supposed to feel guilty when you do something wrong or immoral. So this type of guilt actually proves that you're a good person with a moral conscience. It's actually a healthy way to feel guilty, but when there is just cause. As a matter of fact, if you don't feel guilty when you harm somebody, then you should be seeking the help of a mental health practitioner, because you're either a narcissist, a sociopath, or a psychopath, and thus a threat to society. Now, what we're going to focus on in this video is the irrational guilt, which researchers have shown surfaces in 5 different ways and is either considered a free-floating guilt or existential guilt. Now, these 5 ways that have been identified are feelings of guilt for something you didn't do, guilt that you didn't do enough to help someone, guilt for something you think you did, guilt that you're doing better than someone else, guilt for something you didn't do but you want to do, such as cheating on your significant other by having an affair with somebody that excites or intrigues you, for example. So these are the 5 established causes of guilt that are often used in psychology, but there is also a 6th cause of guilt which I want to discuss in this video, and that is, as Freud pointed out, because of the development of civilized society. Now, the way in which we are raised as children teaches us how to repress our true nature. It causes us to split off aspects of our personality. So repression subsequently creates a complex, and complexes surface in various forms, but with accompanying emotions or obsessions, and guilt is one of these emotions that surface due to repression. In his 1923 book The Ego and the Id, Freud wrote, "The mechanisms by which the sense of guilt is kept unconscious is easy to discover. The hysterical type of ego defends itself from the painful perception which the criticisms of its superego threatened to produce in it by the same means that it uses to defend itself from an unendurable object cathexis, by an act of repression. It is the ego, therefore, that is responsible for the sense of guilt remaining unconscious." So what Freud is saying here is that the intellect that causes repression because it isn't allowing the instincts to express themselves. So repression frequently happens when children are disciplined unfairly and made to feel as though they are bad and not acceptable by a civilized society. Children that are shamed by their parents or teachers, for example, will typically feel guilt because they learn to repress aspects of their personality that are deemed unacceptable. So before I get into unpacking why you might experience free-floating irrational guilt from time to time, I want to share a couple of personal stories with you that demonstrates how free-floating guilt surfaces and show you the potential reasons for how guilt can become a subconscious program. So my stories may help you to understand why you may also be experiencing free-floating guilt. So the first story I'm going to share was an occasion when I felt guilty even though I wasn't guilty of anything, nor had I any reason to feel guilty. It was when I was probably 14, maybe 15. A teacher came into our classroom during a lesson and asked if anybody knew who had sprayed graffiti on the gym wall. Now, this teacher was clearly angry, and it was obvious that he was hunting down the culprit to discipline them. Ironically, he was the art teacher, so you might have thought that he'd take a sense of pride in the graffiti, but hey ho, he was actually really a very angry man. But anyway, I felt a sense of guilt even though I had nothing to do with the graffiti. So why would this be the case? Why did I feel guilty? I certainly didn't know why at the time. But I'll come on to that in a bit. But first of all, I want to share another story with you that is more recent. Now, this has been an ongoing scenario in my head for about 3 years until I finally dealt with it a few months ago, because I came to realize what this scenario was, what these feelings of guilt was. So over the last few years, I've had this recurring conversation in my head that I'm in this courtroom and I'm defending myself before a judge. This courtroom setting is actually just a fantasy that's created by my mind, but the conversation is based around actual issues that I anticipate that I may face. Conversations that I could potentially have, for example. And they're around being criticised for my opinions and my worldview. But what this basically broke down to was a feeling that my opinions and worldview is not acceptable in the eyes of other people. Essentially, my mind is not good enough. Now, ever since I was 6 or 7, I've had this subconscious program that criticises me for not being good enough, and sure enough, there have been many times during my life where people don't share my opinions or worldview. I just seem to see things differently than other people sometimes. Now, whether I'm right or wrong is really just a matter of opinion. But when people disagree with me, my ego identifies with the program that I am not good enough, which then prompts me to be defensive and protect my emotional survival, essentially. Now, this is what often happens with people that are insecure and have an inferiority complex. Now, it's because we feel incompetent and as though we are not good enough. One more thing I want to add here is that according to researchers, free-floating guilt also appears in various other guises, including anxiety, depression, sadness, agony, grief and loneliness, all of which I've experienced around this guilt and which I also associate with the caretaker archetype. And I did used to be a people pleaser because I wanted to feel useful and appreciated, because I didn't think that I was good enough. And essentially that's what the subconscious program is around guilt. It's that you do not feel good enough. So that gives you a clue of how you can heal guilt. So if you haven't watched my videos on the caretaker already, then I recommend you head over there and watch them, especially if you are experiencing free-floating guilt. But first of all, let me explain how this guilt was seeded in my experience. Well, for starters, my father was hypercritical and he never praised me even when I did well. So for example, I once finished second in the entire class and he said, "Why didn't you come first?" But I think my guilt was actually seeded by a teacher before that incident. Probably when I was around 6, maybe 7, I was definitely in junior school. And I have a very vivid memory of this actual incident. Now, what happened was a teacher punished me for not being able to do a maths sum. I know, I was a really bad child. Not only was I punished though, I was also shamed. Now, to this day, I remember standing at her desk whilst the rest of the class were just chattering among themselves. So the noise was distracting me, but also I felt under a lot of pressure in that moment, and I distinctively remember having brain fog and I just couldn't work out this maths sum. Now the teacher became very frustrated with me. I don't really know why, but maybe she just thought I wasn't trying hard enough. She thought I was intelligent enough to answer the question, and maybe she suspected that I was taking the piss or something like this. But whatever it was that pissed her off, she felt it was a serious enough violation for her to warrant giving me a black spot. Now if you didn't have black spots at your school and you don't know what they are, a black spot in our school was a way to discipline a child that misbehaved. And when you were given a black spot, you were then hauled in front of the assembly, where you were hung out to dry in front of the entire school. Now I suppose the intention for this form of punishment was to make an example of children that misbehaved in ways that are not acceptable, and thus their misdemeanours were used to set an example to the other children. However, knowing what we know about repression these days, it's easy to see how shaming children installs guilt. So in my 7-year-old mind, I was being punished unfairly because I couldn't finish a maths sum. So the program that is seeded in my subconscious is that I'm not good enough. But what our school was actually doing was humiliating children and seeding guilt and shame in the subconscious mind that most of us, if not all of us, carried into adulthood. So if you were punished unfairly and made to feel ashamed, it's probably one of the root causes of your free-floating guilt that you're now experiencing as an adult. Now what made my humiliation worse was that on the day that I was supposed to stand in front of assembly, I feigned illness and skipped school. However, the teacher in question was not prepared to allow me to get off scot-free, so she raised the issue in the next assembly, and then I was called to the front of the school on my own, whereas normally on the Friday there's normally 4 or 5 other kids there. But on this occasion, because I had to skip school, I'd been dishonest. All eyes were on me, and only me. So the sense of humiliation and the feeling that I'm not good enough was even more intensified. So there I was being accused of something that I felt was unjust. Now this subconscious program was repeated through my life, including the graffiti incident at school that day. I felt guilty because I thought I was going to be unfairly accused again. Now this fantasy scenario that I played out in my head as well was also based around being criticised or accused of being wrong or simply not good enough. So it's important to observe how your free-floating guilt is surfacing. Is it because you expect to be blamed for something you haven't done, or is it because you suspect you might be treated unfairly? Or maybe it's because at the root of your guilt you simply do not feel as though you are good enough. Do you feel guilt when you do something you expect people will judge you for example? Now you can see this can easily happen to a child that is criticised, shamed or humiliated for doing something that is innocuous, like being a child. Now to be accepted by parents, teachers, etc., children learn to repress parts of their personality in search of approval. We want to feel as though we are good, we want to feel as though we are accepted. But when we are made to feel as though we are bad, we have to then prove that we are in fact good, which the intellect does by repressing your instincts, which are the animal nature of mankind. But they're also the godlike nature. If you do want to know more about what repression is and guilt, there's several articles on the Mastermind Content website that explain all this. So I'll leave links in the description below. But you're still probably wondering why you feel guilt when you have a subconscious program that informs the ego that you are not good enough. Now that's where Freud's superego comes into play, because Freud believed the superego makes you feel guilty. Another quote from his book, The Ego and the Id, Freud says, Analysis shows that the ego is being influenced by processes that have remained hidden from the ego. In other words, they are unconscious. It is possible to discover the repressed impulses which really occasion the sense of guilt. The superego is thus proved to have known more than the ego about the unconscious id. So I just want to explain this a little bit. Freud's superego is essentially what Jung called the archetypes, and the id, you can say, is the self. Now the archetypes are part of the self as well, that project onto the conscious mind, and when the ego identifies with this energy, it's normally in the way of a coping mechanism. When it identifies with this energy, it then becomes part of your habitual nature and is programmed as a subconscious program. Now moreover, archetypes, which are essentially energies, emerge as complexes, and they exist to inform you that something is not quite right with your psychological structure. It means there is an imbalance caused by a split-off aspect of the personality, which then subsequently becomes buried in the unconscious. And that means that the conscious mind is too one-sided. It's oriented towards the external world and the ego rather than inwards towards the self. Now, when you ignore aspects of your personality, you don't develop the ego adequately enough to grow and succeed in life on a higher level. The ego really needs to be informed by the self. Now this means that you don't actually achieve your potential. So the superego, or rather it's the archetype of the sage, otherwise known as a judge by the way, makes you feel this sense of guilt. And scientific research shows how guilt is a biological phenomenon, and it occurs as a result of a child being made to believe they are bad. Now studies show that the free-floating guilt can arise from a specific behaviour that's perceived to be bad. So you may be doing something that is completely normal as a child, but it's considered unacceptable or shameful to that civilized society that Freud talked about. And this is what happens when the central nervous system represses an aspect of your true nature. Consciousness becomes split off. Part of your personality becomes split off, and it is not accessible by the conscious mind. But then that split off consciousness is an energy which then surfaces as a complex, which Jung associated with an archetypal energy projecting from what he called the collective unconscious onto the personal unconscious, what we're calling at Mastermind Content a subconscious program. So Jung wrote, the contents of the personal unconscious are chiefly the feeling toned complexes, as they are called. They constitute the personal and private side of psychic life. The contents of the collective unconscious, on the other hand, are known as archetypes. So remember that guilt is an emotion, and it's a programmed emotion that is essentially a feeling toned complex, which is the personal and private side of psychic life that Jung talks about. It's a complex is normally an energy that is incompatible with an habitual behavior, because there's a specific attitude that is adopted to a habitual behavior that the complex counteracts. It basically, Jung's called this an act of rebellion from the unconscious. Now Freud noticed also that this internal sense of guilt is a form of self-criticism, the inner judge which criticizes you with self-tormenting guilt. Using Jung's model, you can see that the archetype projects onto the conscious mind and becomes a subconscious program in the form of a guilt or guilt complex. But when complexes are left unchecked, they stunt your personal growth and create chaos in your relationships and other aspects of your life. But the real purpose of a complex is really to agitate a feeling of unease that tells you that something is wrong and needs addressing. Signals like irrational guilt are an opportunity for growth. So irrational guilt arising via the superego, or more precisely the repressed sage archetype, is informing you that you have a subconscious program that is preventing you from achieving your potential because you don't feel good enough to actually achieve your potential. The program that you're not good enough is actually just an illusion created by an experience you had when you were a child. And all this happened purely because you were made to feel bad, or as though you are a failure and punished or accused of something natural which you felt was harsh. So to heal guilt, then you need to change these ego-driven habits that generate guilt. Now, in other words, you've got to give up habits that make you feel guilty or inferior and adopt ways of being that develop your personality, improve your relationships, and give you the drive to get better and better. Because whatever ways you can improve yourself, you should improve. And to do this, you need to take care of your needs, which is the realm of the caretaker archetype. And the mantra of this archetype is to pay yourself more respect. It actually helps to heal the wounded sage. Ironically, the caretaker archetype can also make you feel guilty because you may need to become more selfish. It depends, it's not the same for everybody, but if you're a people pleaser and you're always giving your energy away to other people, then that's when you need to become more selfish so that you can dedicate time to do the things that you need to do. This is what I mean by self-care, or paying yourself some respect. So when you feel this guilt come up through doing things you need to do through the caretaker, it's actually good healing practice because you're then able to observe why you're getting these feelings of guilt. And if it is because you're doing things for yourself and you feel guilty for not doing things for other people, then it's an opportunity for you to change your attitude towards your feelings of guilt and heal that. Well, you heal the subconscious program by transforming it. So for example, if you are a people pleaser and you experience free floating guilt when you do something for someone else, be rational and reasonable about whether you have a responsibility for them or whether you have a responsibility for yourself. I talk more about this actually in the Caretaker Part 2, so if you haven't seen that video yet, check it out from the Mastermind Content YouTube features page. I'm going to leave a link to that in the description below, but it'll also be at the end of this video. Now, self-care or self-respect, as it can be called, is the role of the caretaker archetype, and this is your capacity to take care of things that you need to take care of. It involves applying values to whatever it is that you're doing with your life. Now, if you are not enjoying doing something, for example, then it's not worth your time. And by spending your time doing it, you're neglecting yourself. You're not paying yourself any respect. Likewise, if you indulge in destructive behaviours and then feel guilty afterwards, you need to learn to identify when you're being ego driven and find ways to honour the archetype that you are ignoring. Now, archetypal energies emerge as complexes. Guilt is associated with a sage archetype that is made to feel as though you're not good enough because you're always being criticised and judged. Now, the healthy qualities of the sage are actually self-awareness and inner knowing, both of which you feel when you come into touch with your true nature. Now, the archetypes are the bridge that help to make that connection between the conscious mind and the unconscious. So if you suspect that irrational guilt is the result of an unjust punishment you received when you were a child, then you need to acknowledge that you have no reason to feel guilty. You then need to forgive the person that handed out this punishment and subsequently dismembered that part of your personality, and then integrate working that split off aspect of consciousness into the conscious mind. Okay, so I hope that helps to explain why you might be feeling irrational, free-floating guilt a little more. And if you did like this video, then please give it a big thumbs up and subscribe to the channel so that you're notified every time I publish a new video. My name is Richard Oldale and you've been watching Mastermind Content. I shall see you soon. Bye bye.